Hello, and welcome to Echoes of the Forgotten Earth, a place where the big old questions don't have to rush, where curiosity can set its coat on the back of a chair, and finally, exhale. Tonight, we're moving into something that feels a little strange at first, a little unnerving if you stare at it too hard, and oddly calming once you let it sit beside you without trying to tame it. It's the thought that humanity may not be living inside its first draft. That maybe what we call civilization isn't a straight ascent, but a repeated attempt. A rebuilding, a return, a rearranging of the same pieces into new shapes. And if that idea feels like sliding open a drawer you haven't touched in years and finding something inside that doesn't belong to the present, that's exactly the mood we're stepping into together. When you hear a question like, how many times has humanity reset? Your mind might reach for the dramatic scenes first. Cities swallowed by sand, temples split by roots, libraries burned and names erased, people reduced to a handful of survivors hunched over a weak flame, trying to remember how to make the world start again. But the truth, at least the one the ground keeps whispering, tends to be quieter than that, more complicated, less like a thunderclap, and more like a slow change in the air pressure you don't notice until you realize you've been breathing differently. A reset isn't always an ending. It's often a pattern, a skill that vanishes because it's no longer practiced, a route that disappears because the coastline shifts, a way of living that fades because the land no longer cooperates. Then, generations later, a different group finds themselves in a similar position and invents the same solution, not knowing they're walking in old footprints. Human history, when you listen closely, doesn't sound like a single marching band moving forward in step. It sounds like echoes, footsteps in a hallway behind you, not threatening, just present. Evidence that others were here, long before your turn, and that the floor beneath you was shaped by their passing. Before we travel too far down these long roads, let me ask you something simple, something that anchors us in the now. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it for you? Right there in your corner of the world. It's a strange contrast, isn't it? You're sitting in a single hour, maybe late evening, maybe early morning, maybe the kind of time that doesn't feel like anything at all, and yet you're inside a moment built by everything that came before you. A timeline that might be less like a clean rope and more like a patchwork, stitched and restitched so many times the seams have seams. And if this kind of slow exploration feels comforting, if it gives you that quiet sensation of standing at the edge of a deep lake at night, I'd be grateful if you stayed close, if you followed along. Spaces like this find the people who need them the way lantern light finds moths. Not because anyone is lost, but because sometimes softness helps when the questions get large. Now, even though we're beginning with the idea of resets, I'm not here to sell you an apocalypse. I'm not here to predict collapse like it's entertainment. This isn't a countdown. It's a listening. Because the present can feel permanent the way a well-lit room feels like the whole house. But if you start walking the corridors of the past far enough, the illusion of permanence begins to dissolve. Walls you thought were solid turn out to be just another layer, another coat of paint, another renovation built over something older. And what we find beneath the surface isn't one neat story. It's layers, attempt after attempt at building stable life. Learning to grow food, learning to store it, learning to trade, learning to cooperate at scale, learning to survive disaster, learning to preserve knowledge, and then, sometimes, losing that knowledge anyway. Sometimes humanity stumbles because the world shifts under our feet. Rivers move, rain changes its schedule, the ocean climbs inland, the seasons become unfamiliar. Other times we stumble because of our own choices. We take too much. We expand too fast. We fight. We build systems that depend on conditions staying exactly the same, and then we act surprised when conditions refuse. Either way, the story doesn't end. It bends. It breaks. It restarts. And it continues. You might think that with satellites, archives, cloud storage, and the modern obsession with recording everything, we would have a crisp understanding of every rise and fall behind us. But the further back you look, the more the timeline softens, like an old photograph whose edges blur first. Whole cultures vanished without leaving a stone with their name on it. Others left behind traces so faint that they were invisible for thousands of years, until a farmer turned a plow through the right patch of soil, and a shard of pottery surfaced like a memory, refusing to stay buried. And then there are the stories myths, told in fragments, legends that sound exaggerated, the kind of tales we're taught to treat as metaphor. But sometimes, when you line them up across continents, you begin to notice repeating shapes, not identical details, but recurring themes. Water rising, darkness lingering, fire falling, people moving because the world demanded it. A reset doesn't necessarily mean everyone died. Most of the time it means something more subtle. A society reaching a point where the world it built could no longer support the weight of it. The land dries, the rain shifts, crops fail, trade routes collapse. Conflict grinds people down until scattering becomes the only relief. Disease travels faster than medicine, or the climate changes so gradually that no one notices until the familiar becomes unreliable. And then suddenly everyone is living inside the same question. What do we do now? And in those moments, resets don't announce themselves with banners. They happen quietly, day by day. A family leaves, then another. Markets thin out. Gatherings become smaller. The center doesn't hold, not because of a single dramatic blow, but because the small daily agreements that kept it together begin to unravel. Only much later, when someone digs down into the earth and finds foundations under foundations, do we name it a decline? Do we call it collapse? Do we draw arrows on maps and speak in confident tones about what must have happened? But the people living through it didn't call it any of those things. They called it life. They endured. They reorganized. They tried again, often without knowing they were part of a repeating pattern. And this is where the idea starts to reshape how we imagine ourselves. We're taught, so often, to picture human progress as a straight line stone, tools to bronze, bronze to iron, iron to industry, industry to the stars, a clean upward climb. But reality is messier. It always has been. It's a wandering path with loops and forks and sudden dips, a trail that disappears under snow and reappears later as if nothing happened. A staircase where some flights crumble and others are rebuilt somewhere else, using different stone, under different skies. If progress were a staircase, we wouldn't be standing on step 1,000. We might be on step 100 looking around in the dimness and wondering what happened to the other staircases, the ones that broke, the ones that sank, the ones that exist only as dust now. To understand resets, we don't start with ruins. We start with a simple, grounding truth. Humans have been here far longer than our familiar stories suggest. For most of our existence, we lived in scattered groups, moving with seasons, reading landscapes like pages, making tools from stone and bone, passing knowledge through story and demonstration, and the patience of elders. They didn't carve their history into monuments. They didn't leave behind clean records, but they survived. They survived droughts and long winters. They survived predators and illness. They survived volcanic skies and shifting coastlines. They survived living close to the edge of possibility, where one wrong turn could end a lineage. And then, slowly, something changed. People learned not just to gather plants, but to tend them. Not just to notice where food grew, but to encourage it. They learned to stay in one place long enough for shelters to become villages, for villages to become towns, and for towns to become cities' knots in a growing network of trade, culture, cooperation, and dependency. And with growth came fragility. For the first time, humans began relying on systems too large to hold in one person's hands. A city could thrive for centuries, then die because a river shifted. An entire region could empty Because rainfall patterns moved north, soil could be overworked until it refused to give back. The larger a society became, the more interconnected everything grew, and the more a disruption could ripple through it like a crack in ice. Some disruptions were natural, some were human-made. Often they were both, tangled together. But the common thread is this: these resets didn't end humanity. They reshaped it. They forced new forms. They pushed people into different strategies. They demanded reinvention. And each time humans rebuilt, they did it a little differently, carrying forward whatever lessons survived, sometimes as practical knowledge, sometimes as cultural habits, sometimes as stories that no one realized were based on real events. As we move deeper into this, it helps to remember, not all resets are dramatic. Sometimes a reset is a quiet decline followed by a shift in direction. Picture a city along a river. Not a mythic city, just a real place. People waking to market sounds, children learning routines, pots simmering, music, arguments, laughter, life. Now imagine the river shrinking, not suddenly, but over decades. The waterline pulling back the way a tide withdraws, crops weakening, fish fewer, wells deeper, families leaving one by one, trade slowing, schools closing. The city doesn't fall in a single night. It fades. And centuries later, someone digs and finds pottery, tools, foundations, evidence that a whole community lived there, with dreams and routines not so different from ours. That same pattern plays out on larger scales too. Civilizations follow arcs: growth, stability, stress, change. Sometimes stress arrives faster than adaptation. Sometimes internal choices make stress heavier. But after decline, the story doesn't stop. New groups form, new ideas spread. Another attempt rises from whatever pieces remain. Reset doesn't mean a race. It means starting again from what's left. So why don't we hear more about these older resets? Partly because evidence is subtle. Many ancient people built with wood and earth, materials that return to the landscape quickly. Tools decay. Stories survive only in oral tradition. Names vanish unless carved into something stubborn. And so much of the deep past lies quiet under soil or ocean or mountain, waiting for accident, for erosion, for someone to dig in the right place at the right time. Another reason is simpler. Humans like tidy narratives. We prefer straight lines. We prefer believing we're climbing steadily upward. It feels safer than admitting how often we've rebuilt, how many times the thread snapped and was tied again. But once you start looking for resets, you see them everywhere. There were moments our species nearly vanished, moments whole knowledge systems disappeared, moments populations shrank so drastically that a single spark, one group trying something new, shifted the course of everything. And the strange, steady comfort in all of this is that humans endured. We are not as fragile as we sometimes fear, and not as invincible as we sometimes pretend. We are persistent. We are resourceful. We rebuild in ways that surprise even us. As you settle into these thoughts, you might notice your curiosity isn't frantic. It isn't chasing answers like a dog chasing a car. It's quieter than that. It's the kind of curiosity that sits down and listens. Because the story of resets is not a tale of doom. It's a reminder that we've always kept going. That when the world changed faster than expected, people adapted. They shared ideas across distance. They held tight to what mattered and reshaped their path when the old road became too hard to walk. And that is where our journey truly begins. With the recognition that humanity's story stretches farther back than our written pages, that behind papyrus and stone inscriptions lies a longer, quieter record written in migrations, in genetics, in layers of earth and ice. A record of restarts, not once, not twice, but many times, each leaving a faint imprint in the world. And from here, we start following those imprints. Some are carved into landscapes, some are buried under ash, some are tucked inside myth, some are revealed through genetics, Some appear in places we least expect. They won't give us perfect answers, but they give us enough to trace the outlines of worlds that came before ours, worlds that ended, and worlds that grew from the remains. And when we think about the past, we tend to picture the familiar highlights: Egypt along the Nile, Rome across continents, temples and empires and monuments that stubbornly survived time. But those are only the surface stories, the visible tip of a much larger shape. Beneath it, hidden in soil, water, and time, are worlds almost entirely forgotten. Beneath the surface stories, beneath the famous names and the stone that lasted, there were whole lives that never expected an audience. People who didn't build for eternity, who didn't carve their lineage into marble, who measured success in seasons rather than centuries. And because of that, the earth kept their secrets with a kind of gentle efficiency. A forgotten world isn't forgotten because it was small. It's forgotten because time is patient, and patience wins. Wood returns to soil, fibers soften into dust, bone breaks down. Clay crumbles unless it's fired and sealed away in just the right conditions. Even metal doesn't truly last. It oxidizes, it dissolves, it becomes something else. And everyday life, the routines that make a place feel real, is made almost entirely of things that do not survive. That's why so much of our past is invisible. Not missing, not meaningless, just quiet. If you could watch a single ordinary year unfold 40 or 50,000 years ago, you wouldn't see prehistoric shadows. You'd see neighborhoods in their own way. You'd see people waking to the familiar sounds of those they loved. You'd see hands mending, cutting, weaving. You'd see the small negotiations that hold a group together. You'd see someone telling a story that makes the children laugh. You'd see grief too, and care, and the slow work of moving forward after a loss. You'd see art appear where no one needed it for survival, pigments crushed from mineral, lines pressed into stone, shapes traced in soot. Handprints too, those quiet signatures that say, I was here, I mattered, I touched this world. And then, in the span of time that matters to geology, that whole year, those whole lives would become a thin layer, a dark seam in soil, a hint of charcoal, a few stone flakes, a scatter of bones. And after enough centuries, even those remnants would hide. The forgotten worlds beneath our feet are not limited to small groups traveling by season. Some belong to communities that stayed, built, organized, and developed their own structures and traditions in landscapes that later became unrecognizable. Many lived through enormous climate shifts. Around the end of the last ice age, warming didn't just mean nice weather. It meant transformation on a scale that is hard to hold in the mind. Ice sheets melted, sea levels rose, coastlines redrew themselves, lakes drained or expanded, rivers cut new paths. Land that had been stable for thousands of years began to change. And people, real people, with habits and hopes, watched their familiar landmarks move. Whole settlements would have been abandoned, not because someone rang an alarm bell, but because the land slowly stopped making sense. The shore crept closer. The salt moved upstream. The soil turned marshy. The fish patterns shifted. The roots became unreliable. And somewhere, eventually, a final decision was made. We leave. That's the thing about gradual change. It doesn't feel like a story while it's happening. It feels like a series of practical choices. A new camp a little farther inland, a different place to plant, a new path for the hunt, another year of adapting until adaptation becomes relocation. Today, many of those places sit beneath oceans, sometimes buried under thick layers of silt, unreachable without advanced tools and hard to identify with certainty. The sea doesn't just cover a landscape, it muffles it. It turns the past into something that requires extraordinary effort to hear. What makes these older worlds so intriguing is that they hint at more complexity than we used to grant them. For a long time, the popular image of early humans was narrow, small, isolated bands living simple lives, limited cooperation, little long-distance exchange. But the evidence that keeps surfacing doesn't support that tidy picture. When we find tool styles repeated across vast distances, we're not just finding objects. We're finding shared ideas. We're finding connection routes of movement or meeting places where knowledge traveled hand to hand. When we find shells far inland, hundreds of miles from any coast, it suggests networks. Either trade or travel or gifts passed across many groups like a whisper that crossed a continent. When we find ceremonial structures older than agriculture, it suggests gatherings for reasons beyond survival. People meeting not only to eat, but to belong, to coordinate, to make meaning, to participate in something larger than a single family's needs. These discoveries don't mean ancient super civilizations. They mean something quieter, and in many ways, more impressive. Humans building social worlds before the systems we assume are required for them. Some of the most striking forgotten worlds are hidden where no one expected them. Underwater shorelines, for example. Ancient coastal sites now deep beneath the waves contain remnants of hearths, flint tools, and fishing equipment. These were once communities thriving near the water's edge until sea levels rose more than 100 meters after the last ice age. Try to imagine that without turning it into a disaster movie. Not a wall of water, not an overnight drowning of everything. A slow retreat, a shoreline that never stopped shifting, a place where children played becoming a place where fish swim, a grove of trees gradually dying because their roots can't handle salt, a sacred spot becoming unreachable, then invisible. People would have moved inland carrying only what they could, and the structures they left behind became the seafloor. A vast underwater archive stretching across continental shelves, millions of years of geology, and, tucked into it, human life. On land, forgotten worlds often hide beneath newer ones. Many ancient cities were built over older settlements. This wasn't because anyone was trying to erase what came before. It was because good locations remain good locations. Water, fertile soil, natural defenses, crossroads. When one community declined or relocated, another arrived and built there for the same reasons. Over centuries, this created deep stacks of habitation. In some places, archaeologists dig down through thousands of years like turning pages in a book written in soil, each layer a different attempt at living in the same place. Most of those layers belong to societies that lasted for centuries and left no written record, no recognizable name. They're remembered only by the shape of their houses, the style of their pottery, the way they buried their dead, the tools they favored. They are ghosts with fingerprints. And a forgotten world doesn't have to be ancient in the way we romanticize. Some societies disappeared only 1,000 or 2 years ago, yet left so little trace we can barely say who they were. In forests, settlements can vanish when vegetation closes over them. In deserts, sand erases architecture with steady patience. In volcanic regions, eruptions bury landscapes in minutes, preserving and destroying at the same time. Earth is constantly reworking its surface, and with it, the evidence of people. Understanding these hidden societies means accepting that humanity has always been more diverse, more widespread, and more inventive than our written record suggests. It means acknowledging that countless groups developed their own forms of knowledge that never made it into surviving texts. They knew how to build shelters that breathed in humid climates. They knew how to find water in places that looked dry. They knew which plants healed and which plants killed. They knew how to read the sky in ways that guided movement and timing. They managed landscapes, sometimes lightly, sometimes intensively, through techniques that left subtle marks rather than stone monuments. Many of these practices were passed down until disruption broke the chain. Drought, migration, conflict, disease, rising seas. When the chain snapped, the knowledge didn't always survive. And what remained behind was eventually reclaimed by land. Still, sometimes the earth preserves a few things unexpectedly well, as if it chose certain details to keep as a reminder. In peat bogs, oxygen-poor conditions slow decay, allowing organic material to survive for thousands of years. In ice, Bones and tools and even human remains can endure in startling clarity. In dry caves, delicate artifacts are protected from moisture like secrets kept in a sealed jar. These fragments allow us to rebuild small pieces of lives that would otherwise be entirely gone. But even when preservation is extraordinary, what we see is still only a sliver, a glimpse through a keyhole into a room that once held whole communities. And there's another reality we often overlook. Many cultures didn't measure their worth in permanence. They didn't build structures meant to outlast centuries. They built what they needed, where they needed it, for as long as it served. Their knowledge lived in memory, in shared practice, in ceremonies, in the voice of an elder, teaching a child. When a community moved, it might leave almost nothing behind that modern instruments can detect. The absence of ruins does not mean the absence of civilization. It means civilization was measured differently. When we begin to imagine human history not as a single line, but as a wide landscape with many paths, the past becomes fuller. Some paths led to large societies with writing and dense cities. Other paths led to smaller groups who lived stable, intricate lives for thousands of years without expanding. Both are human. Both matter. Both contributed knowledge that shaped later generations in subtle ways. Through genetics, through language echoes, through tool traditions, through crops domesticated by hands whose names were never recorded. There is something grounding in recognizing that so much of our past lies hidden. It means we're walking on layers of stories, many of which shape the conditions for our own world. The plants we grow today were domesticated by people we cannot name. The early techniques of tracking seasons and predicting weather emerged from observation repeated across countless nights. The first navigators, the first long-distance traders, the first groups who learned to coax food from soil rather than search for it, many belong to societies washed away by time. Yet their work survives quietly in our routines. And sometimes when people say, advanced, they imagine metal, towers, machines. But advancement doesn't always look like height. Sometimes it looks like sophisticated plant knowledge, astronomy sharp enough to time migrations, engineering with natural materials that lasts because it works, not because it impresses, social systems capable of coordinating large groups without written bureaucracy. There are sites older than agriculture with structures that required planning, organization, and shared effort. Places that challenge the assumption that complexity arrives only after farming. They tell us humans were experimenting long before we gave them permission in our timelines. Across the planet, the land still carries the marks of hands we can no longer name. Terraces carved into mountainsides, fields aligned with water flow, reservoirs built with layered stone, forests that look wild, until satellite images reveal geometry patterns of ancient land management grown over like scars that healed. Sometimes these reminders aren't obvious until someone notices the soil behaves differently, or a crop grows strangely lush in one strip of land, or a drone camera catches straight lines where nature usually curves. Quiet footprints of forgotten worlds. Recognizing these buried histories changes how we view our place in time. Civilization isn't a one-time achievement. It's something humans have built again and again in different forms. Some lasted for millennia, others flourished briefly. Each altered its environment, influenced migrations, spread ideas, and formed foundations for later societies, whether acknowledged or not. And these buried worlds teach us something else about resets. They don't always involve catastrophe. Sometimes they happen slowly through environmental drift, shifting resources, or gradual merging. A culture may decline quietly as its people join neighboring groups. Traditions blend, languages soften into each other. Unique identity dissolves into broader patterns. Over time, the distinct shape fades until it can't be separated from what came after. The world they built becomes one more layer in the landscape. When researchers uncover these older worlds, they often describe a feeling that surprises them, a closeness that doesn't come from grandeur, but from details. A child's footprint in dried clay, cut marks on bone from a tool held thousands of times, charred seeds from a cooking fire, the worn edge of a scraper that fit perfectly in someone's palm. Small things, ordinary things. And suddenly, the distance of thousands of years collapses into an instant where you can almost feel the presence of another person, not as a myth, not as a concept, but as a life. The more we learn about these hidden societies, the more we realize how much is missing. Vast regions have never been thoroughly studied. Deep oceans, thick forests, remote deserts, frozen expanses, places where evidence waits or decays unnoticed. Every year, new sites are discovered that push the timeline back, adding chapters we didn't know existed. What we know now is only a fraction of what happened, and it's likely that many worlds will never be found at all, erased completely by time. Yet the uncertainty itself matters. It tells us human history is larger than the version we usually tell. It stretches beyond our earliest chronicles. It includes peoples whose influence threads through the present even though their names are gone. And that depth, those countless layers beneath our feet matters when we talk about resets. Because no reset happened in isolation. Each one unfolded inside a far older, wider human story. The worlds beneath the surface become a foundation for understanding how many times humanity reshaped itself. They remind us that answers aren't found only in monuments or written accounts, but in persistent traces left by millions of people who lived through change we can only imagine. Shifts in climate, in landscape and resources, in the delicate balance between stability and struggle. They adapted, sometimes successfully, and sometimes not. Their worlds may be forgotten, but the patterns they lived through continue into every era that followed into ours. And speaking of patterns, there's one turning point so deep, so early, so quietly transformative that it doesn't feel like a reset until you realize everything after it depends on it. Fire. Fire is so ordinary to us now that it's easy to forget it was once impossible. We light stoves and candles as if flame belongs to us by default, as if warmth is a given. But there was a time when night was a rule we could not negotiate. There was a time when darkness meant surrendering the landscape to eyes better suited to it than ours, when cold could end a life in a single stretch of bad weather, when raw food limited the body and the mind, when safety was not a place, but a brief condition that could vanish. And then, long before villages, long before myths took their familiar shapes, long before the forgotten worlds beneath our feet, fire entered our story in a way that bent our path. At first it wasn't ours. It came from lightning, from volcanic breath, from burning landscapes that made animals flee. Humans likely watched it the way any animal would, with fear and caution hovering at the edges, unsure whether it was a threat that would chase them or an opportunity they could steal. But curiosity has always been one of our oldest tools. Curiosity pulled us closer, and we learned warmth. We learned cooked food. We learned that predators hesitate at the edge of flame. We learned that a group could sit together at night instead of scattering into darkness. We learned that the day could stretch longer than the sun. This didn't happen in a single moment. It wasn't a clean invention with a date stamped on it. It was generations of watching and trying, carrying embers, protecting coals, building small shelters for heat, learning the difference between a fire that devours and a fire that serves. The moment fire became something humans could maintain, something we could keep alive after the lightning was gone, was the beginning of one of our first irreversible shifts. Not a collapse, a reset of possibility. Cooking alone changed everything. Raw food demands hours of chewing and energy spent on digestion. Cooking softens, releases calories, widens what can be safely eaten. That changes bodies over time, teeth, jaws, digestive systems, and it changes brains too, by freeing energy for growth and complexity. Fire also reshaped social life. Night became a gathering space. People sat in a circle of light, eating, talking, teaching, telling stories. Bonds strengthened. Communication grew richer. Knowledge moved more reliably from one mind to another. And with fire, humans began to do something new, shape the environment instead of only enduring it. Controlled burns cleared land, encouraged fresh plant growth, drew animals to new grazing, reduced pests, created open areas that made travel and hunting easier. It wasn't agriculture yet, but it was a step toward managing landscapes toward the idea that the world could be adjusted. Not conquered, adjusted. Fire turned the dark into a place we could inhabit. It made the cold negotiable. It allowed movement into regions that would otherwise be lethal. It gave continuity as groups traveled into unfamiliar territories. And you can still see its imprint in the way fire appears in myths across cultures. Fire as gift, as stolen treasure, as sacred force. Those stories remember, in symbolic language, that flame wasn't just a tool. It was a turning point, a quiet hinge on which the whole human story swung. Fire didn't erase what came before it. It didn't replace older instincts the way a new operating system wipes a hard drive. It layered possibility over instinct. It added a new room to the house of human life. And once that room existed, we never truly went back to being what we were before. But even with fire at our side warmth, light, cooked food, the safety of a circle at night, there came a time when the world pressed in hard enough that the path forward narrowed until it was barely a path at all. Human history is often told like a climb, but deep in the climb, there is a moment where the staircase almost disappears. A moment when the world became unfamiliar and punishing, when seasons slipped out of rhythm, when the margin for error shrank to almost nothing. Not a single cold night, not a hard year, not even a difficult decade. A long winter. Not winter as we mean it now, with heated rooms and weather forecasts and the confidence that spring is scheduled. This was cold as a condition, cold as a shape the world took and held. A broader climatic shift where temperatures dropped fast enough to knock ecosystems out of balance. We can see hints of it now in ice cores that hold old air like a sealed memory, in ash layers, in abrupt changes in ancient plant remnants. When the climate changes quickly, the earth doesn't whisper, it leaves scars. For humans, still living close to what the land could provide, this kind of shift wasn't a story. It was a test. Before the cold tightened its grip, people were already spread across a variety of landscapes. They moved, adapted, learned. They had fire, they had tools, they had social structures that supported cooperation. They were becoming good at being human, but they were still tethered to the environment. When the cold arrived, plants struggled, animals migrated or declined, water sources shifted, predictable patterns blurred. In some places, people could no longer remain where they'd lived for generations. They had to move, not as explorers, but as the displaced. Sometimes quickly, sometimes in stages, sometimes following the last reliable resources like a line of light through fog. And as conditions worsened, the habitable world shrank. This is what's hard to imagine. Not the cold itself, but the narrowing. The sense of being pushed towards smaller pockets of survivable land refuges where food could still be found, where water remained accessible, where a shelter could hold heat. Not everyone made it. Genetic studies suggest a period when humanity may have been reduced to a startlingly small number. The estimates vary, and the truth is tangled, but the shape of the story remains. A bottleneck, a narrowing so sharp it left an imprint inside every living human being now. Imagine the lived experience of that narrowing. Wind that never feels like it stops. Hunger that presses into every decision. Days spent searching, tracking, hoping. Nights where fire is precious and fragile. Where the difference between a living ember and cold ash is the difference between safety and exposure. Groups shrinking. Not by drama, but by attrition. Illness, injury, the quiet failure of bodies under strain. The loss of elders' knowledge leaving with them. The loss of children's futures disappearing before they begin. The world becomes smaller and harsher, and survival becomes a discipline practiced daily. And yet even here, humans kept going. They refined clothing, not fashion function. Better stitching, better insulation, better use of hide, fiber, fur. They improved shelter, learning how to keep heat from bleeding away into wind. They became sharper hunters, not because they wanted to master nature, but because failure was too expensive. They learned ways to store food. They learned to divide responsibilities more deliberately, some tending fire, some scouting, some gathering, some watching the vulnerable. These weren't leaps. They were incremental adjustments. But together they formed a pattern. Adaptation through pressure. One of the striking features of this long winter is that it changed movement. Instead of spreading outward, groups concentrated. Instead of exploring widely, they stayed close to what could be trusted. A water source that didn't freeze completely. A valley that still held game. A coastline that offered seasonal abundance. And with concentration came deeper dependence. Cooperation stopped being a virtue and became infrastructure. Sharing wasn't a moral ideal. It was survival mechanics. People who worked well together endured. Groups that fractured under conflict paid the cost quickly. During this period, home began to mean something different. Less a fixed location and more a dependable cluster of people. A small constellation of human beings who could create stability even when the landscape refused. The instincts we recognize in ourselves now, our sensitivity to belonging, our fear of isolation, our need for community, were sharpened in moments like this. Not invented, but refined. The long winter also changed planning. When conditions are harsh, short-term improvisation isn't enough. You need timing. You need anticipation. You need the ability to watch patterns and predict. Our ancestors learned to pay closer attention. Subtle shifts in animal behavior, the feel of wind, the thickness of ice, the rhythm of scarce seasons. They became more strategic in travel, hunting, shelter building, and resource storage. These pressures didn't just change what they did, they shaped how they thought. The world during this period wasn't uniformly frozen. Some regions remained habitable, though still difficult. Forests thinned, grasslands became cold steppe, lakes and rivers froze longer. In some places the land resembled modern tundra. In others it became a patchwork ice, snow, hardy vegetation, and long stretches of empty. And still, people made meaning. This is one of the most human details we keep finding across time. Even when survival consumes most energy, humans keep a small portion of themselves reserved for something else. For expression, for symbol, for ritual. Archaeological evidence from harsh periods still shows small carvings, simple markings, pigment use, objects that carry no obvious practical purpose. Not elaborate masterpieces, but humble proof that humans did not become purely mechanical under stress. They held on to more than breath. They held on to identity. Innovation during the long winter did not spread widely. People were isolated. Travel was difficult. Contact between groups may have been rare. Improvements happened locally. A better spear point, a smarter trap, a new way to insulate a shelter, a clothing pattern that retained heat. Isolation meant knowledge didn't travel fast, but it also meant solutions diversified. Different regions developed different techniques based on what materials were available and what challenges were most urgent. When the climate later eased, that diversity became a storehouse of ideas. The long winter didn't erase humanity. It narrowed it. It squeezed our species into the tight corners of survival, reducing numbers but strengthening resilience. Those who endured became ancestors of everyone alive now. The strategies that worked, cooperation, flexibility, observation flowed forward into all later societies. And when the world began to warm again, it didn't instantly become generous. Landscapes shifted slowly. Forests returned gradually. Animal patterns changed unevenly. People began to spread outward again, but with caution, carrying a memory of scarcity even if they didn't speak it aloud. The memory of hard years can outlive the hard years. It can become a shadow that shapes decisions for generations. where to settle, what to store, how to share, how to treat risk. In genetic data, this narrowing remains visible. A population bottleneck leaves signatures, reduced variation, clusters of shared ancestry. The quiet mathematical proof that at one point the species was perilously small. That means something simple and unsettling. All modern humans descend from those who survived when survival was nearly impossible. It's a reminder that our existence is not guaranteed by destiny. It's carried by endurance. As the climate stabilized into warmer conditions, humans moved outward again, following rivers, animals, and seasons into regions that had been too harsh before. These movements weren't sudden floods of migration. They were slow, generation by generation expansions, families, and small groups moving, adjusting, building new routines in new places. And these expansions didn't just repopulate the world. They set the stage for new experiments, settlements that lasted longer, tools that grew more specialized, social networks that became wider, belief systems that deepened, and eventually, much later, agriculture that took root in multiple regions. But between the narrowing and the later flowering, there were countless communities whose names are lost, societies that formed and faded without written record, entire worlds that rose, bent, and dissolved into the landscape. And this is where our story begins to widen again. When people picture ancient civilizations, they often picture the ones that left behind monuments tall enough to outlast empires. Pyramids, stone temples, massive walls, city grids seen from the sky. But those visible civilizations are only the surface. There were societies older than our official timelines used to allow, organized, skilled, capable in ways that still surprise archaeologists. Some had forms of agriculture earlier than expected. Some built settlements that reveal planning. Some traded materials over long distances. Some shaped landscapes with systems so subtle they were mistaken for nature, until technology revealed the pattern. One reason these societies disappeared from our cultural memory is simple. Most didn't build in stone. Stone survives. Wood does not. Clay crumbles unless conditions are perfect. Metal corrodes. Textiles vanish. So when we imagine the past, we imagine what lasted, not what was most common. But imagine a thriving village built from wood and reeds, packed earth and woven material, families farming nearby fields, crafting tools, raising children, holding celebrations, living with a sense of ordinary continuity. Now imagine the village abandoned because the rains changed, because a river moved, because disease passed through, because conflict made the place unsafe, because the soil tired. The roofs collapse, plants overtake the remains. A generation later, the outlines are faint. Centuries later, it's gone. Thousands of years later, all that might remain is a scatter of pottery fragments, a stain in the soil, a few charred seeds. And if a later community builds over the same place because water is still nearby, because the land still offers promise, the older layers are sealed away. This happened again and again across the world. Rivers buried worlds in sediment. Forests swallowed fields. Deserts advanced. Volcanic ash sealed entire landscapes. Seas rose and erased coastlines that had once been central to human life. The earth does not preserve everything equally. It preserves what it can, where it can, when it can. And that uneven preservation shapes our story, making some eras loud and others nearly silent. We know those silent eras existed because of contradictions that surface. Pottery where pottery shouldn't be, agriculture appearing suddenly across distant regions, tools made from materials that traveled too far to be coincidence, art that hints at belief systems without giving us their language. Consider early farming societies in places that are deserts now, regions that were once green, once fertile, once hospitable enough to support communities for thousands of years. People lived there. They planted, they managed water, they built and rebuilt. Then climate shifted, slowly but decisively. The fields dried, irrigation channels filled with sand, homes dissolved into dust. Today, those places look empty. But emptiness can be an illusion created by time. In forests, lost worlds hide beneath vegetation that grew after human presence faded. Soil chemistry hints at cultivation. Tree patterns reveal ancient clearings. Mounds and depressions suggest homes and roads. Sometimes the networks were extensive settlements linked by roots, landscapes shaped by long-term management. These were not isolated groups living without structure. They were societies adapted to their environment in ways that don't always leave monumental architecture behind. Along coasts, the story grows even stranger because the map itself has changed. Beneath shallow offshore waters, researchers find tools, hearths, traces of structures, not isolated points, but fragments of once living landscapes. Whole cultures lived along coastlines that are now drowned. Their histories didn't vanish because they failed. They vanished because the planet moved. There were also societies whose monuments were not stone buildings but earthwork shapes and structures made from soil itself. These can be enormous, visible only from above, spanning vast areas. Over time, they flatten, erode, and vanish into vegetation. Some still exist but were recognized as human-made only recently. These cultures organized labor, planned large-scale projects, created symbolic forms and gathering spaces that revealed deliberate design. Not primitive, just built from materials that blend back into the world. Another reason civilizations become lost is that many declines were slow. Slow decline leaves fewer dramatic clues. No clear destruction layer, no grand ruins, no fire-blackened moment. People drift away. Buildings weaken. Time smooths it all. A thriving center becomes a gentle rise in a field where grass grows differently. And without dramatic evidence, the past becomes harder to name. Sometimes societies were overwritten by those who came after. New groups settled, repurposed materials, redirected water, rebuilt the world with their own priorities. Over generations, memory faded. The earlier inhabitants became stories, then fragments, then nothing, until objects were found beneath newer foundations like a message from a deeper layer. Someone lived here before. What matters in all of this is that lost societies still shaped humanity. Their innovations didn't vanish completely. Techniques spread, crop varieties traveled, tool traditions carried forward. Water management ideas reappeared in new forms. Even when a culture dissolved, pieces of it lived on in neighboring groups through exchange and intermarriage, through shared practice and borrowed solutions. A forgotten world might have introduced a crucial crop, a method of storage, a tool shape, a social strategy, then vanished, its name gone, its story silent, while its influence continued. And there are places, mysterious sites, that don't fit our older assumptions. Structures that suggest planning older than expected. Gathering sites before agriculture should have existed. Evidence that humans experimented with community and ritual long before formal states. These sites aren't outliers so much as reminders. Our timelines are provisional. They are maps drawn with incomplete information. The silence left behind by these civilizations is part of what makes them haunting. When there is no writing, no readable symbols, no direct record of belief, we're left with outlines, distributions of pottery, wear on tools, burial patterns, building shapes. The material record gives us structure without narrative. And in that absence, the imagination rushes in. But the earth asks us to be patient, to hold uncertainty without forcing it into a neat story. Modern technology can reveal more than ever. Ground-penetrating radar, satellite imaging, LiDAR that strips forests away digitally to reveal geometry beneath. We see roads under jungle. We see foundations under cities. We see patterns that suggest large populations where we were taught there were none. But even now, these tools don't resurrect full lives. They show shapes. They don't give names. They confirm the depth of the past without filling every gap. And this is another lesson of resets. Memory is fragile. Without writing and durable materials, stories can vanish in a few generations. Oral traditions shift. Details blur. Events become symbolic. Sometimes descendants live on the edge of their ancestors' ruins without recognizing the ground beneath them is their own history. This pattern has happened everywhere. Africa, the Americas, Asia, Europe, Oceania. Every continent holds traces of societies that lived full lives and then faded. These lost worlds are not evidence of failure. They're evidence of rhythm, rise, flourish, stress, change, dissolve, recombine. And while all of this was unfolding on land, while forests swallowed villages and deserts covered fields, the oceans were doing their own slow work, redrawing the boundaries of possibility. Because sea levels are not stable, they haven't always looked like our maps. And long before any civilization wrote coastline into law and assumed it would stay, the seas rose in ways that forced one of the largest shared resets humanity has ever experienced. Not through a single day of catastrophe, but through generations of steady, relentless change. When we look at the world now, with shorelines drawn in clean strokes on maps, with ports and cities clustered along the water, as if the ocean has always agreed to stop exactly where it stops today, it's easy to forget that the boundary between land and sea is negotiable, not in human terms, in Earth terms. During the Ice Ages, enormous amounts of water were locked away in glaciers. Sea levels were dramatically lower than they are now. What sits beneath the ocean today, vast plains, river valleys, gentle hills, was once exposed land. In some places, regions that feel separated by water now were connected by wide, walkable landscapes. And people lived there. Not as visitors, not as rare wanderers crossing empty space, but as communities who built their lives around those lands. They hunted, gathered, fished, and learned the rhythms of those environments. They developed roots, they raised children, they placed meaning on particular stones, particular bends in rivers, particular groves where the world felt familiar. Then the cold loosened its grip. The planet warmed and the ice began to melt. It didn't happen overnight. It unfolded over centuries, then millennia. But slow does not mean harmless. A coastline does not need to vanish in a single dramatic surge to destroy a way of life. A steady encroachment is enough. The waterline shifts. The salt creeps into freshwater. Storms reach farther inland. Fields flood more often. Shoreline resources move. The places that once anchored a community become unstable. And the reset begins, not as a headline, but as a sequence of decisions. A family moves a little inland. Another follows. A village rebuilds farther back. A path that once connected settlements becomes marsh. A trade route becomes unreliable. A gathering site becomes unreachable in the season when it used to bring everyone together. Gradual change has a particular cruelty. It rarely looks like danger until it becomes unavoidable. For some groups, there was time to adjust. They retreated inland in stages, carrying knowledge with them, transferring routines from drowned land to new ground. For others, the change accelerated. In periods of rapid melt, sea level rise could surge in pulses enough to make a coastline feel like it was shifting in the span of a lifetime rather than in the span of legends. Even without a single disaster day, these pulses could produce crisis, shrinking arable land, resource scarcity, and competition with groups already living inland. And that's the part we don't always picture when we imagine sea level rise in deep time. It wasn't just loss of land, it was pressure. When habitable space narrows, people don't vanish politely. They move, they overlap, they negotiate, they trade, they merge, they fight, they adapt. A slow flood can still force a fast decision when food runs short. As the seas rose, connections broke. Land bridges that once allowed movement of people, animals, and ideas became waterways. Regions that once shared culture through regular contact became separated. A widening channel doesn't just divide geography, it divides memory. Groups on either side of new water boundaries began to diverge. Their languages drifted, their tool traditions changed, their mythologies reshaped. Their solutions to local problems became distinct. Within enough time, shared origins softened into the kind of similarity that feels coincidental. And because so much of the evidence now lies underwater, We struggle to see the full scope. But sometimes the ocean gives us small proofs. A flint tool found beneath shallow coastal waters. A fishing weight. A hearth remnant sealed in sediment. A layer in the seabed that shows human activity, then abruptly shifts to marine deposits. These aren't just artifacts. They're punctuation marks in the story of a shoreline that moved. Imagine a settlement near a river delta 15,000 years ago. Homes of wood and reed, tools of stone, a daily life shaped by tides and fish runs and the seasonal generosity of wetlands. For generations, the river's behavior was familiar. It swelled, it receded. The people knew its moods. They timed their work to it. And then, year after year, the waterline rose. Not enough to panic in a single season. Enough to notice, though. Enough that grandparents and grandchildren would disagree about what normal looked like. Fields that used to stay dry began to flood more often. Trees died from waterlogged roots. The ground softened. The landscape blurred. At first, people adapted. They moved gardens. They changed fishing spots. They rebuilt slightly higher. But eventually the adaptation itself became exhausting. You can only retreat so many times before you realize you're living inside a slow evacuation. So they left. They carried what they could. Tools, children, knowledge, stories. They carried the memory of the old place, too. Though memory changes shape when it's no longer anchored to visible land. Behind them, the sea kept rising. Their homes collapsed. Their pathways vanished. Sediment covered what remained, and the ocean became a lid. This pattern repeated worldwide. In some places, sea level rise was the main force. In others, land subsided as ice weight lifted, reshaping coastlines even before water arrived. Some communities moved hundreds of miles over generations, following the shifting edge of land. Others moved only a little, adjusting again and again, living through multiple environmental transitions within the same cultural lineage. The rise of the seas did more than drown settlements. It reshaped ecosystems. New coastal waters formed, altering fish populations. Plants adapted to brackish environments. Animals migrated inland. Humans who remained coastal had to develop new fishing methods, new shelters, new ways of navigating tidal patterns. Humans who moved inland had to learn different resources, different seasons, different relationships with neighboring groups. These changes weren't only physical, they were cultural. Belief systems evolve when the world evolves. Practices tied to particular landmarks are forced to change when those landmarks disappear. Knowledge suited to a drowned landscape becomes less useful on new ground. Some traditions adapt, others fade. The losses are not always visible in artifact layers. Sometimes they're visible only in absence. A tool type no longer made, a practice no longer needed, a story that becomes symbolic because its original reference point is underwater. There are underwater landscapes today that may preserve evidence of these ancient worlds better than many dry sites ever could. When a site is buried in silt and sealed from oxygen, organic materials can survive. Wood, plant remains, even footprints pressed into sediment that later hardens. But these submerged archives are difficult to reach. Underwater archaeology is expensive, risky, technically demanding, and still rare compared to land excavation. So we have a vast chapter of human history lying out of reach, not erased, but inaccessible. And into that silence, humans carried stories. It's worth noting how many cultures across the world have flood narratives. They aren't identical, and they shouldn't be forced into a single explanation. But the recurring theme overwhelming water transforming familiar land makes sense in a species that lived through coastlines migrating for thousands of years. A myth compresses time. A century of shoreline retreat becomes a single night of rising water. A multi-generational relocation becomes a single dramatic journey. Not because the story is a lie, but because the human mind preserves meaning more easily than measurement. In that way, myth can be an emotional record of geological change. There were also land bridges, broad corridors of dry land that once connected regions now separated by ocean. When those bridges vanished, their disappearance didn't come with a declaration. It came as increasing difficulty. A journey that once took days becomes dangerous, then impossible. The shared pathway becomes a barrier. Over time, isolation becomes normal. People stop speaking of the crossing as something real and begin speaking of it as something ancestral, then mythical. The loss of connection altered the spread of languages, technologies, and cultural practices. It contributed to divergence. It created pockets of human experience that developed independently, forming unique solutions and traditions. And yet, the rise of the seas also created new opportunities. As shorelines stabilized in new places, rich coastal environments formed. River deltas became fertile. Marine resources expanded. New coastlines attracted settlement, just as old coastlines had. In a strange way, the same force that erased older communities laid foundations for later ones. Destruction and creation braided together, as they often do. But between those eras is a stretch of quiet of lives lived and then covered. Names lost, identities blurred, entire histories sealed beneath water. When the ocean took those landscapes, it took detail. And that's one reason resets feel mysterious to us. The evidence is unevenly preserved. We see what survived on land more easily than what sank. It's important to remember that the people who lived through this did not see themselves as lost civilizations. They were simply people. They made decisions with the knowledge they had. They built communities suited to their environment. They adapted as long as adaptation worked. Then they moved when they had to. The disappearance of their world is not proof of failure. It's proof of a dynamic planet. When we ask how many times humanity has reset, rising seas offer one of the clearest answers. Not a single reset, but countless. Not one dramatic collapse, but repeated forced adjustments, migration, reorganization, blending, fragmentation, and rebuilding. Coastlines that once anchored life became memory. Techniques for navigating drowned landscapes became obsolete. Traditions tied to specific places transformed or ended. New traditions rose along new shores. Resets do not always break humanity. Sometimes they rearrange humanity. And the movement of the seas didn't only change maps. Warmer oceans altered weather. Rain patterns shifted, storm tracks changed, temperatures adjusted across continents. Vegetation changed. Animals moved. Each environmental shift triggered more adaptation. Each adaptation added to the long, layered record of resilience. Some of the earliest signs of complex human behavior may lie beneath the ocean. Early permanent shelters, organized hunting routes, community meeting spaces. Not because underwater societies were more advanced, but because coasts have always offered abundant resources and stable patterns, perfect conditions for social complexity to emerge. If those early coastal chapters are drowned, our picture of human history is missing a foundational portion. That absence can make certain developments look like they appeared suddenly inland, when in reality they may have matured along coastlines first, and then migrated with displaced people. Rising seas also shaped how knowledge moved. When communities relocated, they brought their skills with them, but those skills blended with new environments and neighboring groups. Innovation became hybrid. Origins became hard to trace. A technique we attribute to a later inland society may have begun as a coastal practice carried inland by migration. Its source erased by water, its influence preserved in the hands that moved. This is how the past becomes a mosaic. Bright pieces, faded pieces, missing pieces. The rise of the seas ensured many pieces would be submerged, and there is a particular weight to that knowledge, not a weight of despair, but a weight of humility. It reminds us the world we inhabit now is not the world, but a version, a temporary arrangement of boundaries. We live on a shoreline that will not stay forever. We build as if it will, because that's what humans do. We build in the present tense. But the earth has a longer grammar, and as the ocean rose and rearranged humanity's map, another kind of reset was happening, one that didn't leave its main evidence in drowned villages or sediment layers. It left it inside us. A narrowing that can be traced through genetics. A passage through a doorway so tight that the echo of it still shapes who we are. A bottleneck, not of land, but of lineage. There's a kind of reset that doesn't leave an obvious scar on the landscape. No buried wall. No ash layer that a future scientist can point to and say, "Here, this is where it happened." No drowned coastline, no toppled temple. Instead, it leaves a trace in the quiet mathematics of the body. It leaves its imprint in the way modern humans resemble each other far more than you would expect for a species spread across every climate, every continent, every island chain we've managed to reach. Long ago, humanity passed through a narrow doorway of survival, a genetic bottleneck so deep that nearly every person alive today carries the signature of it. It wasn't recorded. There were no inscriptions, no announced turning point. But the evidence is in the variation we do and do not carry, in the books of genetic information that were lost when the shelves were suddenly emptied. To understand what happened, imagine the world before the bottleneck. Humans were already living in many parts of Africa and beyond, in small communities shaped by place and season. Not huge populations, not dense cities, but enough groups, enough lineages, enough variation accumulating over time that the species as a whole held a broad library of genetic diversity. Then, something changed. The trouble is, the Earth didn't leave a clean label on the event, and so we're left with possibilities rather than certainty. A severe climate shift, a chain of volcanic eruptions that dim the sky, a disease that moved through scattered groups, competition with other hominin species, changes in prey availability, a combination of pressures stacking at once like weight on thin ice. Whatever it was, human numbers dropped sharply enough that we can still detect it by looking at the genetic patterns in people alive now. Genetics is like a kind of archive. In large populations, there are many variations, many ways to be human accumulated across countless ancestors. When a population collapses, many of those variations vanish, not because they were bad, but because the people carrying them did not survive or did not have descendants. And then, when the population grows again, it grows from what remained. A bottleneck is a narrowing point the entire species must pass through. The world expands again on the other side, but it expands with fewer threads than before. In the human story, this narrowing was extreme. Some research suggests humanity may have been reduced to only a few thousand individuals at one point. Other estimates are even smaller. Some studies propose that survival depended on small, scattered refuges, isolated groups holding on in different pockets, not necessarily connected, each facing its own version of scarcity. Picture that reality without romance. Small groups living at the mercy of weather and migration patterns, a drought that stretches longer than expected, a cold snap that kills plants and disrupts animals, a sickness that arrives and doesn't stop with one household. A conflict over a water source that a band cannot afford to lose. In such a world, fire isn't a convenience. It's a lifeline. Clothing isn't culture. It's survival. Shelter isn't comfort. It's the difference between waking and not waking. And social bonds become the strongest technology humans have. Because a lone individual is not a stable unit in a harsh environment. A group can share tasks, share heat, share food, share knowledge. A group can care for the injured. A group can protect children. A group can remember. Imagine a family living through this period, not as a heroic episode, but as a series of practical days. Wake, check the fire, check the sky, feel the air, decide whether to travel, decide whether to hunt, decide how to ration what remains. Decide how to move without wasting energy. Decide how to keep the children close enough to be safe and far enough to learn. There is no guarantee that effort will be rewarded. There is only the discipline of trying again. And the bottleneck likely wasn't a single sharp drop and an immediate recovery. It may have lasted thousands of years, long enough for whole lineages to disappear, long enough for the species to thin out and hover near the edge. A slow crisis is hard to reconstruct because it doesn't leave one clean crater. It leaves a long smear of struggle. But the genetic evidence still points to the same truth. At some point, humanity became dangerously small. What makes this bottleneck especially eerie is how its effects linger. Despite the obvious diversity of human cultures, languages, traditions, appearances, ways of living, humans are remarkably similar genetically. More similar than many people assume. Some animals with far smaller ranges have more genetic variation than we do. This doesn't mean humans are identical. We're not. There is real variation, meaningful variation. But compared to what scientists would expect for a species of our size, our genetic similarity reads like the descendant signature of a population that survived by the narrowest of margins. And that matters for understanding resets, because it suggests that at least one of humanity's resets was not regional, not merely the fall of a society or the flooding of a coastline. It was species-level pressure, a narrowing so severe that it shaped the foundation of all later expansions. After this bottleneck, as human groups began to spread outward again into new climates, new landscapes, new continents, they carried only a subset of the earlier variation. They adapted to new conditions as they went, skin tones shifting with sunlight exposure, body forms adjusting to temperature and altitude, cultural practices evolving to handle deserts, forests, mountains, and tundra. But those adaptations began from a smaller genetic base than what existed before the narrowing. The bottleneck doesn't mean the survivors were superior. It means they were positioned by chance, by knowledge, by circumstance, in places where survival was possible. They had access to a reliable water source. They had a cooperative group. They had fire management. They had a shelter strategy. They had timing, or they were simply spared by randomness long enough to have descendants. Tiny advantages magnify over generations. A slightly better camp location, a slightly more efficient tool, a slightly stronger social bond, a slightly clearer method of teaching. And in a world where margins are thin, slightly becomes everything. The bottleneck also reshaped social life. Small groups under intense pressure cannot afford misunderstandings. Communication becomes critical. Teaching becomes urgent. Cooperation becomes non-negotiable. When every individual matters, group stability becomes a survival trait. This doesn't mean people suddenly invented language in a single leap. It means pressure likely favored clearer, more consistent communication. The ability to share complex information about resources, danger, timing, tool-making would have improved survival odds. Over generations, even subtle shifts toward better communication can shape the development of language structures. And with language comes deeper coordination. With coordination comes stronger bonds. With bonds comes the ability to endure. Another layer of mystery is that different methods suggest different timelines for bottlenecks. Genetic evidence points to dramatic reductions tens of thousands of years ago, while archaeological records hint that there may have been multiple narrow points, several periods when human numbers thinned severely. Humanity may have passed through more than one doorway. Each narrowing would have occurred alongside other resets, climate swings, volcanic winters, sea level changes, disease, and interaction with other hominin species. It's impossible to talk about early human survival without acknowledging that humans were not alone. Neanderthals, Denisovans, other lineages whose names we may never recover. Our ancestors encountered them, competed with them, learned from them, interbred with them. Those interactions shape survival too. In some cases, they may have offered genetic advantages for certain environments. In others, they may have intensified competition for resources. The story is complex, layered, and not neatly moral. Some researchers have linked one possible bottleneck to a massive volcanic eruption that could have thrown ash into the atmosphere and cooled the planet. That kind of event can disrupt ecosystems across wide regions. But even here, certainty is hard. Humans are adaptable. Some refugees may have been less affected. Some groups may have survived by coastal resources or by mobility. The uncertainty around cause doesn't weaken the bottleneck's significance. It strengthens it in a way, because it reveals that survival was not dependent on a single variable. It was dependent on overlapping pressures and overlapping responses. Climate, food, water, disease, social cohesion, tool making, fire, migration timing. The bottleneck was not one story. It was many stories converging into the same outcome: fewer humans, fewer lineages, a narrowed future. And yet this is important. Low population did not mean the end of human creativity. Even in harsh periods, humans kept making tools, refining strategies, creating symbolic objects, expressing meaning in ways that didn't obviously feed the body but fed something else: identity, continuity, the feeling of being part of a story that extends beyond the next meal. This suggests something fundamental. Survival isn't only physical, it's psychological, social, cultural. A group that can maintain cohesion, hope, and meaning can endure pressure longer than a group that fractures into despair. As populations slowly recovered on the far side of the bottleneck, the descendants of survivors carried knowledge outward. Expansion out of Africa happened in waves, not as a single sweeping migration, but as repeated movements of small groups exploring, settling, and adjusting. They followed animals. They followed rivers. They followed coastlines. They moved because they could, and because the world, once again, offered enough stability to permit it. Over thousands of years, humans spread across the globe. But the bottleneck's imprint remained embedded in every population, a shared ancestry that explains why, under all our surface differences, humans are a tightly related family. This is one of the quietest, deepest resets in our story. Not a collapse with ruins, a thinning of the human thread. A reminder that what feels inevitable now was once uncertain. And the bottleneck offers another lesson. When humanity rebuilds, it rebuilds with what it can carry. Not everything survives. Not every lineage. Not every technique. Not every story. Some knowledge disappears simply because the people holding it do not. And this brings us to another repeating rhythm of resets, one that plays out not just in deep prehistory, but in every era after. The cycle of knowledge itself. Because humanity does not only rise and fall in population, humanity rises and falls in memory. We discover, we build, we refine, and then, sometimes, we forget. There are moments in the human story that don't unfold through flood or fire or ice, but through something softer. The way memory slips when no one has the space to hold it. When people imagine knowledge, they tend to picture it as something safe, something written down, shelved, archived. A scroll that survives, a tablet that endures, a library that protects what matters. But most knowledge has never lived in ink. Most knowledge is muscle and habit. It is hands remembering angles, eyes recognizing plants, ears catching the difference between safe weather and dangerous weather. It is a mother showing a child how to twist fiber into cord. It is an elder demonstrating how to strike stone so it flakes the right way. It is a hunter teaching timing, not with a chart, but with a story. Practical knowledge survives only as long as it is practiced. And when populations move, when climate shifts, when communities fracture, when a way of life becomes impossible, practice breaks. That's when knowledge becomes fragile. We often picture history as if ideas are simply stacked one on top of another: stone tools, then bronze, then iron, then steam, then electricity, then spaceflight. A staircase. But real progress has always been more like a trail that winds, disappears under snow, and reappears later, sometimes in a different place, sometimes with different people, sometimes with the same solution emerging again, as if it were new. Discovery, loss, rediscovery. This cycle has played out more times than we can count. Consider something as simple as stone tools. The physics of stone flaking are consistent across the world. If you strike the right kind of rock at the right angle, it breaks in predictable ways. Early humans learned this through observation and repetition, and over time, they refined it into techniques so precise that modern knappers can still recognize cultural styles in the shards. But those skills were not guaranteed to persist. Move a group into a region with different stone, and the old methods may not apply. Shift the environment so that stone tools are less useful than bone tools, and practice fades. Fragment a community, and only one subgroup carries a technique while the others carry different fragments. Generations later, a different group may rediscover the same principles because the rock still breaks the way rock breaks, yet they'll experience it as invention, not inheritance. That's one of the humbling truths of being human. Sometimes what we call new is simply the world allowing the same answer to be found again. Early cultivation shows the same pattern. Long before agriculture became widespread, many groups likely experimented with managing wild plants, clearing competing growth, scattering seeds, tending favored patches. These practices can thrive for a time and then vanish when climate changes, when people relocate, or when the plant species itself becomes less available. Later, entirely separate communities in different regions began their own experiments, developing similar techniques with no direct connection. The need was similar, so the solutions converged. This isn't limited to stone and seeds. Humans have reinvented counting systems, record-keeping methods, navigation strategies, construction techniques, and social structures again and again. Sometimes because the old knowledge was lost, sometimes because the environment changed and demanded a new approach, sometimes because contact between communities broke and ideas stopped traveling. A society might develop a reliable way to track seasons by the stars, then lose it if they move to a region where the sky is often clouded, or where the horizon is different, or where the cultural focus shifts. Later, another society looks up, notices patterns, and builds a new calendar system from scratch. Both methods serve the same purpose. Neither is guaranteed to last. Sometimes knowledge fades, not because it is forgotten, but because the resources required to practice it disappear. A community may know how to build large structures, but if timber becomes scarce or stone sources become inaccessible, the skill becomes dormant. The idea remains in fragment stories, partial techniques, but without materials, the full craft cannot be maintained. Then, centuries later, conditions change, resources return, people try again. The technique re-emerges, familiar in shape but different in detail. Knowledge doesn't always vanish completely. It often survives as a shadow, a tool whose purpose becomes unclear, a ritual that continues even after its original function is forgotten, a story that remains compressed, symbolic, guiding behavior without explaining why. These shadows can become seeds for rediscovery. There are also times when knowledge is deliberately simplified. Survival pressure can force efficiency. A complex craft might be abandoned because it takes too long. A beautiful technique might be replaced by a faster one because hunger doesn't allow elegance. The simplified version becomes normal. The deeper complexity fades. Later, when stability returns, people experiment again, rebuilding sophistication piece by piece. This is why progress is not a straight climb. It expands and contracts depending on what life demands. Migration is another powerful engine of forgetting. When groups relocate, they often leave behind skills tuned to their previous environment. Coastal fishing expertise becomes less useful inland. Cold weather storage methods fade in warmer regions. A tool shaped perfect for open plains becomes impractical in dense forest. The environment selects which knowledge remains active. And fragmentation can divide knowledge like splitting a book into pages and scattering them across the wind. When a large community breaks into smaller ones because of drought, conflict, disease, or resource strain, each subgroup carries only part of what the whole once knew. Over generations, those fragments drift. Some are preserved, some are lost. Some evolve into new forms. When groups reconnect later, their combined knowledge is not a restoration of the old. It's a new blend, a new world built from old pieces. This is one of the reasons the deep past feels so complex. It isn't just that we lack records. It's that humanity itself has lived through repeated reorganizations where the continuity of knowledge was interrupted. And yet, there is a quiet resilience in this cycle. Even when knowledge disappears, humans retain the ability to uncover it again. The world still offers the same materials, the same principles, the same physical laws. The mind still has the same curiosity. The hands still have the same capacity to learn by doing. Rediscovery often begins with a small observation. Someone notices a plant grows better when surrounding vegetation is cleared. Someone heats clay near a fire and discovers it hardens. Someone notices a certain stone flakes into sharp edges with predictable force. Someone watches the stars and realizes their movement can mark time. Small discoveries accumulate. They spread through conversation. They become routine. They harden into tradition. And then, to later generations, they feel ancient, always there, even if they were rediscovered only recently. This is how entire technologies can be reborn without direct inheritance. It's also why parallel invention appears across the world. Different societies, separated by oceans and millennia, build similar solutions because the problems are similar and the constraints of physics are shared. You see it in architecture, alignments with sun and stars. You see it in engineering, walls built to endure tremors. You see it in agriculture, terracing, irrigation, soil management. You see it in navigation, reading wind, water, bird movement, cloud patterns. These parallels do not require hidden global teachers. They require human attention and repeated necessity. And the cycle of knowledge loss and rebirth isn't only practical, it reaches into social systems too. Communities constantly experiment with how to live together, assigning roles, sharing labor, resolving disputes, caring for the vulnerable. Some social structures thrive for generations. Others prove fragile and collapse under stress. Later societies reinvent similar solutions because the questions remain. How do we distribute resources? How do we prevent conflict from tearing us apart? How do we raise children and care for elders? How do we build trust? These questions reappear across time. The answers change shape. But the pressure to find answers remains. Crisis accelerates these cycles. During harsh periods, communities may pause art, ritual, complex craftsmanship, not because they stop caring, but because time becomes scarce. When stability returns, these practices often reemerge, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, because they serve needs beyond survival: identity, belonging, meaning. This is another quiet truth. Humans don't live on calories alone. We live on connection. We live on story. We live on the sense that our suffering and joy exist inside something larger than the day's weather. As humans spread across the world after bottlenecks, sea level rises, and climate swings, the cycle of gaining, losing, and rediscovering knowledge shaped cultural diversity. A technique perfected in one region might never reach another. A method might vanish in one valley and persist in the next. A practice might be forgotten and later rebuilt by descendants who think they are inventing it from scratch. Even now, this cycle hasn't stopped. Modern people rediscover ancient practices regularly, sometimes through archaeology, sometimes through experimentation, sometimes through necessity. Methods of soil building, water management, seed saving, and sustainable land use that were once dismissed as primitive often reappear as solutions to modern pressures. Not because the past was perfect, but because humans have been problem solving for a very long time, and some solutions remain useful when conditions repeat. Knowledge in this sense doesn't disappear completely. It lingers in the possibilities of the world. It waits for the right questions to summon it. What ties this entire cycle together is continuity. Knowledge survives when people teach, when communities remain stable enough to practice, when environments remain consistent enough to keep a method relevant. Knowledge fades when those conditions break, but the ability to rediscover is also part of continuity. The continuity of human curiosity, attention, and resilience. And now, when we look at the long arc of reset's cold eras, rising seas, population narrowings, lost civilizations, the cycle of knowledge becomes one of the strongest threads linking it all. People carry what they can. They lose what they must. They rebuild what they need. Sometimes the only record that something was once known is the way the same idea appears again later, wearing different clothes. And there is a place where this becomes even more haunting. Because when you begin listening across cultures, across oceans, across continents, you find stories that echo each other, themes that repeat with strange consistency. Floods, long darkness, fire in the sky, migrations triggered by forces beyond control. At first, they look like myth. But when you listen in the way the Earth asks us to listen patiently, without forcing a conclusion, those myths begin to feel like another kind of archive. Not precise, not dated, but carrying the emotional truth of real resets. And that is where we go next, into the way memory survives inside story, how myth compresses centuries into moments, and how echoes can travel farther than stone. Across many regions of the world, when researchers sit with the oldest stories kept alive by voice long before ink, they begin to notice something that feels almost impossible at first. Patterns, not the same names, not the same gods, not the same landscapes, but recurring shapes that appear again and again, even among peoples separated by oceans, mountains, and thousands of years of isolation. A great flood that remakes the land, a darkness that lingers too long, a winter that doesn't end, fire falling from the sky, a migration prompted by forces no one can negotiate with, a warning wrapped in narrative, carried forward because it mattered. At first glance, these stories look like myth in the modern sense, symbolic, exaggerated, untethered from literal history. But the longer you listen, the more you realize that myth is not the opposite of memory. Myth is often what memory becomes when it has to travel farther than facts can endure. Before written language, people preserved experience through narrative. A story told by firelight could carry a lesson longer than any technical explanation. The past didn't need to be measured in exact years or defined by coordinates. It needed to feel true enough to guide behavior. A myth is a vessel. It holds meaning. And meaning survives where detail does not. When we look at myths through the lens of resets, some connections begin to make a quiet kind of sense. Flood stories, for instance, appear across nearly every continent. They vary wildly in detail. Some speak of a single family saved, others of a community warned, others of a world washed clean and restarted. We should be careful not to flatten them into one story. But we can still notice the shared theme: water overwhelming familiar land. That theme fits a species that lived through rising seas, shifting rivers, glacial melt, coastal drowning, and sudden flooding events. Communities who watched shorelines creep inland for generations would have carried that loss in their collective memory. Children would have heard about the old land the way people now speak of a hometown they can't return to. Over time, as the original coastline disappeared, literal references became harder to explain. The story remained, but it changed shape. It became symbolic. The flood became a single event, a single night, a single decision by the sky, because a story that lasts must be compact enough to carry. Myth compresses time. A century of shoreline retreat becomes a moment when the sea rose. A multi-generational migration becomes a single journey. Not because humans were lying, but because the human mind preserves what it can. Darkness stories appear too. Tales of a sun that dimmed, of days that felt wrong, of seasons that slipped out of their proper rhythm. In some places, the story is a long night. In others, it is ash in the air. In others, it is a cold so severe the world seems to have turned away from warmth. These themes echo periods of climatic disruption, volcanic eruptions that threw ash and sulfur into the atmosphere, abrupt cooling events that altered ecosystems, times when plant growth faltered, animals moved, and humans were forced to adjust. A community living through atmospheric dimming would not describe it in scientific language. They would describe it emotionally. The sky changed. The light changed. The world felt wrong. And when their descendants retold the story centuries later, the details would bend toward the needs of the present. A warning, a moral, a cosmology. The event might become an act of gods or spirits, but the core experience, unfamiliar darkness, could remain. Then there are stories of fire coming from above, of stars falling, of a burning sky, of a terrible heat, or a flame that changed the world. Some of these may reflect meteor events. Some could echo volcanic fire seen on the horizon. Some might preserve memory of wildfire regimes that followed climate shifts. Lightning-driven burns across dry landscapes can create scenes that feel like the sky itself is attacking the earth. Again, myth does not give us dates. It gives us shapes. It gives us a way to recognize that humans across the world have been startled by the same categories of change: water, cold, darkness, fire, migration, loss, rebuilding. And migration stories, those are everywhere. Communities remembering an origin elsewhere, an ancestral homeland lost or left behind, a long journey prompted by hunger, drought, conflict, or the movement of animals. Sometimes the story names a river or a mountain. Sometimes it describes a crossing. Sometimes it speaks of following birds or stars. Sometimes it describes an escape from a threat that cannot be reasoned with. Archaeology tells us humans moved repeatedly, not in one simple wave, but in countless expansions, retreats, and relocations. Climate pressure can push groups, resource changes can pull them, rising seas can force inland movement, conflict can scatter communities, disease can empty regions. Myth often holds the emotional truth of these movements, the feeling of leaving, the grief of displacement, the necessity of starting again. There's a reason these stories persist. They are not only records, they are tools. A story about a flood can teach children not to build too close to certain waters. A story about a drought can teach caution, storage, respect for seasonal uncertainty. A story about fire can teach fear and reverence for a force that warms and destroys. A story about migration can teach resilience. We have moved before. We can move again. Even when the original event fades, the lesson remains. That is one of myth's functions, preserving guidance across resets. Another reason myth travels so far is that it carries more than information. It carries tone, fear, awe, grief, gratitude. Myth preserves the psychological imprint of a reset even when the physical evidence is gone. A people who lived through a slow drowning of their coastline would not only remember lost land, they would remember the feeling of inevitability, the way normal life became increasingly difficult, the way each generation adjusted until adjustment became departure. That emotional imprint can persist long after the coastline itself is forgotten. And myth also has a way of preserving echoes of knowledge transfer. Many cultures have stories of beings who came before, or teachers who gave humans essential skills: fire, agriculture, weaving, law, medicine. We shouldn't read these figures literally, but we can consider what they might symbolize: the memory of older groups, older lineages, or neighboring cultures whose knowledge once shaped a community. A firebringer might preserve the memory of a real period when fire use spread through a region, when one group learned from another, when a new way of living entered the shared world. The teacher becomes a character because stories need faces. What matters is that the narrative recognizes a turning point, before and after. As societies grew more complex, myths layered on moral and social meaning. Floods became punishments or tests. Darkness became consequence. Fire became gift or theft. Migrations became sacred destiny. These layers do not necessarily erase historical roots. They adapt the story for new generations. Because myth must remain useful. It changes so it can persist. And this is where it becomes tempting to treat myth like a code that can be cracked into precise historical fact. But myth is not a timeline. It is not a fossil. It is a living thing. Researchers can compare myth patterns with geology, climate data, and archaeology. When story and science point in similar directions, the overlap can be illuminating. Flood narratives paired with evidence of sea level rise. Darkness stories paired with evidence of volcanic winters. Earth-shaking tales paired with seismic history. But even then, myth doesn't give certainty. It gives context. It tells us what the event felt like to those who endured it. That feeling matters because resets are not only environmental shifts, they are human experiences. They reshape identity. They reshape how communities interpret the world. They reshape what is feared and what is valued. And perhaps that is why, even today, people are drawn to stories of great change. We recognize the pattern in our bones. We sense that the world is not static. We sense, somewhere deep, that our species has been forced to adapt repeatedly. Myth is one of the ways we keep that sensing alive. And yet, not every myth points to a literal event. Some arise from imagination, from the need to explain what cannot be understood, from the attempt to give shape to mystery. But even those myths reveal something true: the way humans process uncertainty. Because uncertainty is one of the oldest constants in our history. When the world behaves unpredictably, humans respond with narrative. We create cause and effect. We create meaning. We create a framework that turns chaos into something a mind can hold. That framework can guide survival. It can strengthen community. It can preserve lessons. And across generations, those frameworks become cultural bedrock. So when we speak of resets, we should remember that the physical world changes, but the human need to interpret and preserve does not. Myth is a bridge across broken time, a thin rope stretched over gaps where writing doesn't reach. And if we follow that rope, if we listen to the echoes embedded in story, we begin to see that resets have always shaped humanity from two directions: from outside, through environment and disaster, and from inside, through choices, conflict, and the fragile systems we build. Because there is another category of reset, one that doesn't require ice ages or rising seas, one that emerges when human societies grow powerful enough to create their own instability. A reset that can begin quietly, through decisions repeated until the cost becomes unavoidable. A near ending that arrives not from the sky, but from our own hands. Some parts of human history reveal themselves not through meteor scars or drowned coastlines, but through moments where humanity nearly stalled under the weight of its own systems. When people imagine existential danger, they often picture external forces: an asteroid, a supervolcano, a flood that rewrites the map. But there have been times when the greatest risk didn't arrive from outside. It emerged from within. These moments weren't always loud. Some unfolded slowly as decisions repeated across generations accumulated into strain. Others were sudden, sparked by conflict or imbalance. But together, they show a hard truth. Once humans built complex societies, we also built complex vulnerabilities. Early conflict existed even before cities' competition over territory, water, hunting grounds. In small groups, the scale of harm was limited. A fight could end a band, but not the species. As populations grew, the consequences of conflict expanded with them. Larger settlements meant greater density. Greater density meant deeper dependence on systems: food storage, irrigation, trade routes, political stability, shared rules. And systems create leverage. When they work, they support thousands or millions. When they fail widely. Resource exhaustion is one of the oldest examples of self-made danger. A community expands, clears forests, overworks soil, drains local water sources. For a time, growth feels like success. Then the margin thins. The land gives less. The harvest becomes unreliable. Fuel becomes scarce. Building materials run short. The society becomes trapped by its own scale. In a small village, a poor season is painful but survivable. In a dense settlement, a poor season can become a crisis that triggers unrest, migration, and cascading instability. Picture a city built near a fertile plain. For generations, rain arrives on schedule. The river floods predictably. Food flows in, people multiply, institutions grow. Then rainfall shifts slightly, floods become erratic, a few lean harvests arrive. In isolation, the changes might be manageable. But within a dense system, strain spreads. Food shortages sharpen inequality. Inequality fuels conflict. Conflict disrupts labor. Labor disruption weakens infrastructure. Weakened infrastructure reduces food production further. A small disruption becomes a reset. This is one reason major collapses often look like sudden endings in hindsight. They are usually the final crack in a structure that has been weakening for a long time. Powerful social structures introduce new risks as well. Leadership can coordinate resources and maintain order, but poor decisions at the top can amplify harm. Overexpansion stretching territory, pushing labor, extracting resources, can create impressive empires that are brittle. When drought hits, or disease spreads, or trade routes falter, a stretched system cannot absorb shock. Collapse, then, is often not a single cause. It is a convergence. Disease became a major force of reset once humans lived in dense agricultural settlements and alongside domesticated animals. In small bands, an illness often burns out quickly because it cannot find enough hosts. In dense towns, disease thrives. Pathogens travel. Immunities vary. Outbreaks reshape populations. Some epidemics occurred long before writing recorded them, leaving little direct testimony, only indirect consequences. Abandoned sites, disrupted trade, sudden demographic change. After each outbreak, societies rebuilt, sometimes with altered structures, sometimes with reduced complexity, sometimes with a shift in where and how people lived. Environmental degradation driven by human activity has also triggered resets. Deforestation erodes soil. Irrigation can cause salinization, turning farmland sterile. Overgrazing can transform landscapes. These changes unfold slowly, which is why they are often ignored until the effects become unavoidable. Another form of pressure came from over-reliant societies built around a narrow resource base, a key crop, a particular trade route, a single river system, a stable climate pattern. When that foundation shifts, the society has few alternatives, and instability spreads. Even technological advances could carry risk. Metalworking strengthened tools and weapons, but also increased demand for fuel and mining. Forests were cut to fire furnaces. Landscapes were scarred by extraction. Some communities grew powerful through resource use, then weakened when local environments could no longer sustain the demands. Across these examples, the pattern repeats. The danger is rarely a single dramatic event. It is the interaction between external pressures and internal fragility. A drought alone might be survivable. Conflict alone might be survivable. Disease alone might be survivable. But drought plus political division plus exhausted soil plus disrupted trade plus epidemic, this is where systems break. And because human societies are human, these pressures often arrive together. One of the most sobering insights from the long arc of history is that humanity's survival has been protected by diversity. When one region collapses, others continue. When one system fails, another persists elsewhere. This patchwork has kept the species from being ended by any single local catastrophe. But it has also meant that resets happen repeatedly at regional scales. Knowledge lost, populations scattered, cultures transformed, continuity broken. As writing emerged, it offered a new way to preserve memory, but it did not end vulnerability. Writing depends on institutions. When institutions fall, libraries burn, records decay, scholars flee. Knowledge can vanish even when it was once carefully stored. There have been eras when societies emerged after collapse with less technical or scientific knowledge than their predecessors. They rebuilt, and in rebuilding, they rediscovered ideas that had already existed. Again, progress as a wandering path. When we trace these near endings, it becomes clear that humanity often walked close to the edge. Not because humans are doomed, but because complex systems are delicate. They can create extraordinary stability, but they can also create catastrophic cascade when strained. And yet, even these self-inflicted resets are not purely destruction. They are also forced learning. People adapt by moving, reorganizing, changing resource strategies, adjusting social structures. Survivors carry lessons forward, sometimes explicitly, sometimes embedded in tradition and myth. A story about a city destroyed by greed may hold memory of resource collapse. A warning about angering a river may encode knowledge of flooding patterns. A myth about sickness as a moral test may echo past epidemics. These narratives persist because they help communities avoid repeating mistakes, or at least recognize the signs before collapse becomes inevitable. Understanding these internal dangers gives us context for the present as well. Because when we look back, the most severe resets are rarely caused by one factor. They are caused by convergence, environment plus fragility, plus human choice. And that convergence, quiet at first, undeniable later, is the signature of a reset from the inside. It's tempting, when we talk about resets, to treat them like artifacts sealed in the past, wrapped in sediment, finished. Cold eras, rising seas, bottlenecks, forgotten cities, cycles of knowledge lost and found. It's comforting, in a way, to imagine those patterns as something humanity outgrew. But resets don't belong only to prehistory. They're not rare, cinematic breaks that happen back then to other people. Resets are simply what change looks like when it becomes large enough to alter the rules a society depends on. And what makes this difficult to recognize in real time is that a reset rarely announces itself from the inside. Ancient people didn't wake up one morning and say, "Today begins the collapse." They responded to what was in front of them. A river behaving differently, a harvest thinning, a trade route becoming unsafe, a sickness spreading, a rival group pressing closer, a cost rising, a resource shrinking, a winter stretching longer than it should. From the inside, it felt like adjustment. One more adaptation, one more workaround, one more decision made because there wasn't another choice. Only later, sometimes centuries later, does the arc become visible enough for historians to name it and draw clean lines around it. In the moment, it's messy, it's lived. And that's why looking at the present through the lens of resets can feel unsettling. Because the question changes. It isn't, will humanity ever face another reset? It becomes, are we already living through one without calling it that? A useful way to approach this is to consider what has changed in our era, not in terms of moral judgment or prophecy, but in terms of pattern. One of the clearest differences between now and most of the past is speed. Earlier transformations often unfolded across long spans, coastlines migrating over centuries, climate shifting across millennia, technology spreading slowly through networks of trade and travel. Now, changes that once took many generations can happen within one. Technology evolves at a pace that compresses adaptation. People learn a skill, build a livelihood around it, and then watch it become obsolete before they're old. Entire industries rise and fall within a few decades. Methods of communication that shape childhood can become outdated by adulthood. This is not inherently bad. It is simply unstable in the way rapid motion is unstable. It demands constant rebalancing. And constant rebalancing can begin to resemble a reset, not because everything collapses at once, but because the ground rules keep shifting. In earlier eras, knowledge was often lost because communities broke and teaching chains snapped. Today, knowledge can be stored more easily than ever, digitized, duplicated, transmitted instantly. But abundance creates its own pressure. When information becomes overwhelming, the challenge is no longer, how do we preserve knowledge? But how do we filter it? How do we verify it? How do we distinguish signal from noise in a storm of claims? Too little information creates ignorance. Too much can create confusion. Both can destabilize decision-making, especially at scale. And scale is another difference. Humanity is now deeply interconnected. In older eras, a drought in one region might drive migration locally, but it would not necessarily ripple across an entire planet within days. Now, networks bind us. Supply chains, finance, communication, politics, media. A disruption in one region can travel outward quickly, not as rumor carried by foot, but as immediate consequence. This global interconnection creates resilience in some ways. It allows resources and help to move faster. It allows coordination. It allows rapid response. But it also creates fragility. Interconnected systems can cascade. When one node fails, the strain shifts elsewhere, sometimes multiplying as it moves. Complex networks are powerful, but they are not always stable under rapid shock. Environmental change, too, echoes ancient patterns, though the causes and tempo are different. The Earth's climate has always shifted, but in our era, human activity has become a major force shaping those shifts. Weather patterns alter, drought increases in some areas, storm intensity rises in others, fire regimes change, coastlines become vulnerable. Again, this isn't about predicting an ending. It's about recognizing a familiar structure, environmental pressure forcing adaptation. In earlier resets, people responded by moving, reorganizing, and reshaping their relationship with land and water. Today, movement still occurs, but adaptation also happens through policy, infrastructure, engineering, technology, and global coordination. The tools are different. The pattern is old. Social structures are also in motion. As populations grow and cultures overlap more than ever, values, identities, and norms shift rapidly. Ideas spread at the speed of a screen refresh. Communities form and dissolve online. Institutions built for slower eras struggle to keep pace with the tempo of change. When the social framework changes faster than people can metabolize it, tension rises. Earlier civilizations faced similar stress when cities expanded too quickly, when inequality sharpened, when governance failed to distribute stability. The present is different in shape, but the underlying dynamic system strained by growth and speed is recognizable. Economic systems reflect this as well. Periods of expansion and contraction have always existed, but now they occur inside a tightly connected global structure. Technology disrupts labor. Automation changes what work means. Entire categories of skill become less demanded while new ones emerge. That's not a simple loss. It's a reshuffling. But reshuffling at this scale, at this speed, can feel like a reset from the inside. People rebuilding identity, livelihood, and community around changing conditions. And there is the psychological layer, the one humans carry through every reset. When the world changes quickly, people seek stability. They seek narratives that make the shift feel understandable. In ancient times, this became myth. In later times, ideology. In modern times, it can become media ecosystems and identity anchors. Humans do not like chaos without meaning. We build meaning the way we build shelter. This is not a flaw. It is a survival trait. But meaning-making can also intensify polarization when different groups build different shelters from different stories. When people are frightened, they cling tightly. When they cling tightly, compromise becomes harder. When compromise becomes harder, systems strain further. That interplay, environmental pressure, technological acceleration, social volatility, economic reorganization, information overload, is what makes the present feel complex, in a way that resembles multiple resets stacked together. And that stacking is important, because the biggest historical breaks usually weren't caused by one factor. They were convergence. Drought plus conflict, plus exhausted soil, plus disease, plus institutional fragility. Sea level rise, plus migration, plus loss of trade connections, plus cultural fragmentation. Convergence is the signature of a reset. So if we ask whether humanity is undergoing a reset now, the question is not, is there one disaster that will do it? The question is, are multiple pressures converging in ways that require us to reorganize how we live? And reorganizing how we live is, at its core, what a reset is. This doesn't mean the end. A reset can be destructive, yes. It can involve loss, yes. But it can also be transition, a reconfiguration that creates new forms of stability. After rising seas, humans built new coasts. After bottlenecks, humans expanded and diversified again. After collapses, new societies formed. After knowledge loss, rediscovery occurred. After long winters, warmth returned, and people carried forward sharpened resilience. Resets are not guarantees of progress, but they are not guarantees of ruin either. They are moments when the present stops being sufficient and the future demands a different arrangement. In earlier eras, adaptation often meant movement relocating to where the world still offered stability. Today, adaptation may mean redesigning systems: energy, food, water, housing, education, governance, communication. And here is where the story becomes less about prediction and more about agency. Earlier people had limited tools. Their agency existed, but it was constrained. They could move, they could store, they could cooperate, they could fight, they could rebuild. Modern humanity has more tools than any previous era scientific understanding. Global communication, medicine, engineering. That doesn't remove risk, but it changes the nature of response. A reset now would not resemble a single civilization falling into silence while others continue elsewhere. It would resemble a complex transformation across a connected world, some regions stabilizing faster, others struggling longer, some systems adapting, others breaking, many people living through uneven change at the same time. And from the inside, it would still feel like adjustment. One more workaround, one more new normal. Until, later, historians look back and say, that was the shift. That was the turning. So where does that leave us here, in the small slice of time you're sitting in right now? It leaves us with a perspective that is both sobering and strangely steady. Sobering because the present is not permanent. Steady because humanity has navigated change before, not once, but many times, in many forms. The past is not a guarantee, but it is a record of resilience. And when you strip away the details of each era and look for what endured across all those transformations, the same quiet elements keep appearing. Cooperation, curiosity, storytelling, problem solving, the ability to rebuild from fragments. These are not modern inventions. They are ancient instincts refined by repeated pressure. There comes a point, after walking through these layers of time, through drowned shorelines, narrowed lineages, lost cities, forgotten skills, myths that carry memory, when it's worth pausing again, not to conclude, but to notice what the echoes have been telling us all along. Not that we are doomed, not that we are safe, but that we are a species shaped by instability, and therefore capable of surviving it, not through perfection, but through adaptation. And that, perhaps, is the most honest comfort the Earth offers. Not certainty, continuity. There comes a point in a long walk through time when the details start to blur together, not because they don't matter, but because the sheer number of them becomes its own kind of weather. Floods, winters, migrations, collapses, recoveries, inventions, losses. The names change, the landscapes change, the tools change. But certain patterns remain, and when you stop chasing the sharp edges of the story and listen instead for what keeps returning, you begin to notice what has carried humanity through every transformation we've touched tonight. Not a single technology, not a single empire, not a single sacred text. Something quieter than that, something older. One of the clearest threads is cooperation. Even before cities, before agriculture, before writing, survival depended on people trusting each other enough to share, enough to teach, enough to divide labor, enough to watch a child while someone else searched for food, enough to care for an injured person who could not contribute for a while, enough to keep a fire tended through the night. When conditions tightened, during long cold periods, during drought, during displacement, cooperation wasn't optional. It became the difference between a group that endured and a group that faded out of the record. This is easy to forget in a modern world that celebrates individual achievement. But the deeper you go into human history, the clearer it becomes. The species did not survive by being solitary. We survived by being social. Another thread is curiosity, the insistence on looking closer. Early humans watched the world with the intensity of people who knew that noticing the wrong detail could be fatal. But even beyond survival, curiosity has always been more than a tool. It is a temperament. It's what pulls a person toward a new plant, a new stone, a new path, a new question. Curiosity is what brought humans close enough to fire to learn what it could do. Curiosity is what turned scattered observations into techniques, sharper tools, better shelters, improved hunting methods, early plant management, navigation strategies, seasonal calendars. And when knowledge was lost, when continuity broke and skills faded, curiosity remained. It didn't preserve every method, but it preserved the impulse to rebuild methods, to experiment again, to try the angle one more time, to see what happens if you do it differently. Curiosity is one of the reasons resets are not endings. It keeps opening doors. Another thread is teaching. Every generation is a bridge. Without teaching, humanity would have to restart from zero after every disruption. And we rarely do. Even in the harshest conditions, people teach. They demonstrate. They tell stories. They correct mistakes. They show a child how to hold a tool, how to recognize danger, how to read the weather, how to build something that works. Teaching isn't always formal. It doesn't need classrooms. It needs attention. It needs patience. It needs the belief that the future is worth preparing for. And that belief is itself an enduring force. Because when people stop believing in a future, societies unravel quickly. When people continue believing quietly, stubbornly, knowledge survives in the only way knowledge can, through living hands. Another thread is the way humans seek connection beyond their immediate circle. Even in early eras, ideas traveled farther than we once assumed. Shells moved inland. Tool styles spread. Materials crossed distances too wide to explain by accident. That means people met. People exchanged. People carried stories and techniques across landscapes. Networks expand and contract during resets. Trade routes break. Groups isolate. Languages diverge. But then, again and again, connection reforms. Humans rebuild bridges, literal and social, because exchange increases resilience. It spreads risk. It spreads knowledge. It creates options. Connection is a survival strategy. It always has been. There's also the thread of meaning-making. This is the part we can't reduce to practical necessity, because it appears even when it doesn't obviously help someone eat or stay warm. People mark stone. They carve bone. They paint walls. They sing. They ritualize. They tell stories that compress centuries into a single night's tale. They create symbols that hold identity in times when the landscape is changing under them. Meaning-making is how humans carry continuity when facts and structures collapse. It is how we keep a sense of we when everything else is shifting. Myth, ritual, art, and shared narrative are not decorations on the human story. They are support beams. They hold communities together under stress. They preserve lessons. They soften fear into something that can be endured. In that sense, culture is not something we do after survival is handled. Culture is part of survival. Another enduring pattern is the relationship between humans and land. Early societies didn't have scientific terminology, but they had expertise. They knew where water lingered in dry seasons. They knew which slopes grew certain plants first. They knew the movement of animals, the timing of storms, the feel of a winter that would be harsh. When people were forced to move by rising seas, drought, cold, conflict, they rebuilt that knowledge in new places. They learned the new land, the way you learn a language. Slowly at first, then with increasing fluency. This is a kind of intelligence that doesn't always leave monuments behind, but it leaves traces in the landscape itself. Terraces, managed forests, altered soils, subtle engineering, pathways worn and reworn. And even when those traces are swallowed by vegetation or sand or water, the relationship itself, the instinct to read the world closely survives. It shows up now in modern science in ecology, in agriculture, in meteorology. Different tools, same impulse. The land is speaking. We need to understand what it says. Another thread is problem solving. In every era, humans faced constraints and responded with adaptation. When prey changed, hunting changed. When water moved, settlement patterns changed. When climate shifted, clothing changed. When disease spread, social behavior changed. When trade broke, local production changed. When old institutions failed, new ones formed, sometimes better, sometimes worse, always shaped by what people had learned and what they feared repeating. The details vary. The structure stays. Pressure creates problems. Humans respond with solutions. And perhaps the most consistent thread of all is the way humans blend continuity with change. When societies rebuild, they rarely start with nothing. They keep what still works. They modify what needs adjusting. They abandon what has become too costly. Old practices persist as long as they remain useful or meaningful, and new practices grow where they're needed. This is why the human story is layered. Each era is built on fragments of the previous one. Even the most dramatic reset is not a clean wipe. It is a rearrangement. Pieces carried forward, pieces lost, pieces remade. And when you look at it this way, a reset stops being a single event and becomes a process, an ongoing human ability to reshape life under changing conditions. That perspective changes how we view our own time. It doesn't demand panic. It doesn't offer complacency. It offers something more grounded, context. Because if resets are part of the rhythm of being human, then the question isn't simply, how do we avoid change? It becomes, what do we carry through change? What do we refuse to lose? What do we teach? How do we preserve cooperation when pressure makes people turn inward? How do we protect knowledge not only by storing it, but by practicing it, sharing it, keeping it alive in living communities? How do we keep the stories honest enough to guide, without letting them become weapons? How do we design systems that can bend without breaking? These questions are not new. They are ancient. They have visited every society in different words, at different moments. And now, as you sit in your own small slice of night or morning, you are part of the same long pattern. Not as a spectator, as a participant. You live on layers. You walk on old worlds. The ground beneath you holds traces of people who adapted, who moved, who rebuilt, who lost and rediscovered, who loved and feared and tried again. And one day, whether we like it or not, we will become a layer too. Our choices pressed into the soil of time, our stories carried forward in whatever form the future can hold. That thought can feel heavy if you let it, or it can feel strangely steady, because it means you are not alone in uncertainty. You are inside a lineage of adaptation, not a perfect lineage, not a guaranteed one, but a persistent one. And if there is comfort to be found in the echoes of forgotten Earth, it is this. Humanity has never been shaped only by what happened to it. Humanity has also been shaped by how it responded. The world changes, the map redraws, the systems strain. The old way becomes too tight. And still, again and again, people gather in whatever light they can create. Firelight, lamplight, screen light, and they teach, and they plan, and they make meaning, and they try to build something that can hold. This is not the end of the story. It is the continuation of the rhythm. And wherever you are listening from, whatever time it is for you right now, that rhythm includes you. Because the echoes aren't only behind us, they're moving through us. They always have been. There's a kind of ending that isn't an ending at all, just a slowing down. The way a story lowers its voice when it reaches the part it wants you to carry with you. Not a conclusion, not a period. More like a hand resting on a doorframe before you step back into your own life. Because the truth is, for all the layers we've walked through tonight, the answers remain incomplete. They will always remain incomplete. Not because the past is simple, but because the past is vast and the Earth is an expert at keeping most of it quiet. So much of human history never hardened into stone. It was built from wood and fiber and breath materials that belong to time. Whole villages made from reeds and packed earth can dissolve so thoroughly that only chemistry remembers them. Entire coastlines of human life sit under oceans, not as myths, not as imagination, but as real landscapes sealed away where only specialized tools and rare chances can reach. And even when we find a fragment, it is still only a fragment. A single tool does not contain the full shape of the hands that made it. A hearth does not contain all the conversations that happened around it. A footprint preserved in clay does not tell us the child's name, or what made them laugh, or what fear they inherited from the adults who watched the sky. What we recover is evidence. What we don't recover is most of the living texture. This is why certainty can be dangerous when we talk about deep history. Certainty can flatten complexity into a story that feels satisfying but isn't true to the scale of what's missing. Because missing is not the same as absent. A culture can vanish without leaving writing and still have been intricate, coherent, intelligent, and meaningful. A society can shape crops, land management, navigation routes, and trade networks and leave behind only subtle traces because their materials return to the landscape. A reset can transform a region and leave no dramatic ruin layer. No heroic final battle. No single day where everything cracked. Sometimes a reset is simply people leaving. Sometimes it's knowledge slipping out of use. Sometimes it's a language dissolving into another language until no one remembers the boundary existed. And then, centuries later, all that remains is a slight rise in a field where soil behaves strangely, or a pattern under trees visible only from above, or a cluster of artifacts discovered by accident because the earth shifted in a storm. We are used to thinking of history as what we can prove, but deep history includes what we can only infer, the shadow of what must have been there, because the present contains its consequences. The crops we rely on were domesticated by hands we will never name. The movement patterns of certain animals were shaped by human landscape management long before we wrote down environmental policy. The distribution of languages carries echoes of migrations that left no monuments. The genetic patterns inside us hold records of narrow survival and expansion that no storyteller could ever fully narrate. And because so much of this is incomplete, the question of how many resets is not something we can answer with a clean number. It isn't 10. It isn't 20. It isn't a list. It is a rhythm. Sometimes the rhythm is fast conflict epidemics, sudden climate shocks. Sometimes it is slow shorelines creeping inland, soil tiring, trade thinning, a city fading rather than falling. Sometimes it is a deep narrowing the bottleneck, the long winter, the moment when humanity became fragile enough that the entire species could have disappeared. And the rhythm continues because the planet continues. The earth is not static. Coastlines shift. Rivers change course. Forests expand and retreat. Deserts migrate. Volcanoes breathe. Ice advances and withdraws. Even without human influence, the world is restless. With human influence, it becomes even more complex. A conversation between our choices and the planet's own long motion. And what's haunting, in a quiet way, is that from the inside, people rarely know they are living through a turning. They know they are adapting. They know the harvest is different. They know the water tastes wrong. They know their children will not live the same life their grandparents did. They know something is changing, but they do not always know what it will become. That's why, when we talk about the possibility of resets now, it helps to remember how earlier people lived through theirs. Not as characters in a cautionary tale, but as humans, making the best decisions they could with the knowledge they had under pressures they could not control. Some survived by moving. Some survived by reorganizing. Some survived by blending with others. Some survived by learning new techniques quickly. Some did not survive. And still, the story continued. This is not meant as a warning wrapped in romance. It is simply the shape of our species' history. Repeated transformation, uneven continuity, persistent rebuilding. If there is something to take from this, not as certainty, but as steadiness, it might be the recognition that the present is only one layer, one chapter written on top of other chapters, a temporary arrangement of systems, habits, boundaries, assumptions, and knowing that does not have to make you feel small. It can make you feel placed, because when you feel anxiety about change, you are not inventing that fear. You are inheriting it. You carry, inside your nervous system and inside your culture, echoes of long winters, lost coastlines, crowded migrations, failed harvests, and rebuilding. Those echoes are not prophecies, they are context. They remind you that humans have always lived with uncertainty, and that the tools we reach for cooperation, teaching, problem solving, story are ancient. We don't need to romanticize the past to learn from it, and we don't need to claim we have perfect answers to honor the people whose lives are buried beyond recovery. Sometimes honoring the past simply means admitting how much we do not know, and letting that unknown remain spacious rather than forcing it into a neat shape. Because the unknown is not empty. It is full of lives, full of worlds, full of daily moments that were complete in themselves. And perhaps that is the final quiet truth the Forgotten Earth offers. History is not only what survives. History is also what was lived. So wherever you are listening from, whatever time it is for you, whatever weather is pressing against your window, remember that you are part of a long human habit, trying to understand where you stand in the unfolding. The ground beneath you holds more stories than any one mind can carry. And yet, you are carrying some of them now. Not as facts, not as dates, as echoes, and that is enough to begin. And now, since you're still here with me, let's do something the past asks of us again and again. Let's return to the beginning without repeating it. Because that's what a reset is in its most honest form. Not a clean restart, not a dramatic wipe. A return to first principles. A moment where the world insists you rebuild from what is real, not from what is assumed. If you could stand at the edge of one of those older turning points, if you could watch a coastline retreat over generations, or feel a winter tighten until even breathing seems expensive, you would see something that doesn't show up in timelines. You would see how ordinary the days still are. People still wake up hungry. They still argue. They still laugh. They still care for children. Still cook what they can. Still repair what breaks. Still tell stories that make the night less heavy. They still fall in love in the middle of uncertainty, which is one of the strangest and most stubborn human traits. We tend to imagine resets as moments where life stops. But life doesn't stop. Life narrows. Life improvises. Life becomes more careful. Life becomes more communal. Life becomes less certain and sometimes more honest. And that's why I keep returning to the quiet version of history rather than the loud one. The loud version is easy to dramatize. Collapse, catastrophe, apocalypse. The quiet version is what most people actually live. A series of adaptations that, only later, become recognized as a turning. And in the quiet version, the question, how many times has humanity reset, becomes less like a trivia question and more like a lens. A way to see that the story of being human is not a straight line. It's a repeated negotiation with a planet that keeps moving and with societies that keep evolving. This is also where the phrase, Forgotten Earth, means something deeper. The Earth forgets in the way nature forgets, by growing over, by burying, by dissolving. But it also remembers through layers, through chemistry, through genetics, through the stubborn persistence of patterns. And humans remember in our own way, through stories, through habits, through the things we do without knowing why we do them. Sometimes, what survives a reset isn't a tool or a monument. It's a reflex, a community reflex, a decision reflex, a moral reflex. the instinct to store a little extra, the instinct to keep the fire going, the instinct to share when you could hoard because you've learned through experience or through inherited story that hoarding makes you isolated, and isolation is dangerous. Those reflexes don't come from textbooks. They come from the long relationship between people and pressure. When you look at human history as layered resets, you begin to see that civilization isn't a single achievement we can finish. It's a practice. It's something humans do the way we do language, imperfectly, collaboratively, differently in each region, but always driven by the same need to create stability in a world that doesn't guarantee it. And in that sense, the question isn't only about the past, it's about the future. Not a predicted future, not a scripted one, but an open one. Because the world ahead will not be identical to the world behind. It never is. The environment shifts, technology accelerates, social structures evolve, pressure converges in new ways. And then we do what humans always do. We attempt, we adjust, we rebuild, we carry forward what matters. So if you find yourself looking at the present and feeling the subtle strain, the sense that systems are stretched, that information is too fast, that the climate is changing its habits, that institutions don't feel as permanent as they once did, remember what we've been circling all along. From the inside, a reset feels like living. From the outside, later, it will have a name. But you don't need the name to choose your response. That's the part of the story we do control in every era. What we carry, what we teach, what we protect, what we rebuild, what we refuse to let go silent. Because the earth will keep moving. The question is whether we move with it thoughtfully, cooperatively, with memory intact, or whether we force the old arrangement to hold until it breaks. And if that sounds heavy, let's soften it again the way this whole space is meant to do. You are not required to solve all of human history tonight. You're allowed to simply notice the depth beneath you, the layers, the echoes, the extraordinary truth that you are alive now, listening now, in a moment that contains the residue of countless past moments, some recorded, many lost, all real. If you want, you can treat that as a burden, or you can treat it as an invitation to live with more awareness of fragility and resilience at the same time. An invitation to understand that permanence is not the default, and that's not a reason to despair. It's a reason to pay attention, to value what's here, to build with humility, to teach what matters, to keep the fire in whatever form your era allows. And maybe that's the last image I'll leave you with, for now. Not an empire, not a ruin, not a disaster, just a small circle of light in a wide moving world, people close enough to share warmth, close enough to speak, close enough to pass something forward. Because that circle more than any monument has been the true engine of continuity. Across every winter, across every flood, across every migration, across every loss of knowledge and every rediscovery. The circle returns, and as long as it returns, the story continues.